The sound of the sprinkler system is the heartbeat of this house. Every morning at 5:30, a dull thud resonates through the floorboards, followed by the rhythmic metallic hiss of water hitting the manicured lawn. Elias designed it that way. He's a landscape architect, a man who believes that nature is something to be curated, trimmed, and forced into submission. He likes things that look effortless, but require a terrifying amount of hidden labor to maintain. I am that labor. I stood in the kitchen, the marble countertops cold beneath my palms. The coffee maker hissed, a mirror to the sprinklers outside. I moved with a practiced, silent efficiency, setting out 2 porcelain mugs, the heavy cream Elias prefers, and a single napkin placed exactly 2 inches from the edge of the mahogany island. If the world were a stage, I would be the stagehand who ensures the lights never flicker and the props are never out of place, all while staying firmly in the shadows. Elias entered the kitchen at 6. He was already dressed in a charcoal suit, his hair swept back with a precision that made him look 10 years younger than 52. He didn't look at me. He looked at the coffee. "The filter was a bit slow yesterday, Sarah," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of any real malice. It was the tone of a supervisor providing a performance review. "Try to descale it today. I have the Henderson group coming by the office at 10 and I can't be late." "I'll take care of it, Elias," I replied. I didn't say that I had already descaled it twice this month. I didn't say that the machine was fine, but perhaps his patience was thinning. He took a sip, his eyes fixed on his tablet, scrolling through blueprints of a park project in the city. To him, I was a fixture of the house, no different from the high-end appliances or the custom cabinetry. Useful, predictable, and entirely uninteresting. The front door chimes rang, a bright, intrusive sound that didn't belong in the heavy stillness of our morning. Elias frowned, his gaze lifting for the first time. Who on earth is that at this hour? I knew the rhythm of that knock before the door even opened. It was a frantic triplet beat, the sound of someone who expects the world to stop and listen. My sister, Nora. I walked to the door and opened it. Nora stood there, a whirlwind of blonde hair and the scent of expensive, stale cigarettes and jasmine perfume. She was 42, but she carried herself with the jagged, desperate energy of a teenager who had just been caught doing something she wasn't supposed to. "Sarah, don't look at me like that," she said, pushing past me into the foyer. She was dragging a designer suitcase behind her. "The apartment flooded. The pipes, the landlord, the whole thing is a disaster. I tried calling you last night, but you probably had your phone on that do not disturb thing you do." I looked at her suitcase, then at the way her eyes darted toward the kitchen, looking for Elias. Nora had always been the problem I was expected to solve. When we were children, I was the one who stitched the heads back onto her dolls. In our 20s, I was the one who lied to our parents about where she was on Friday nights. "Nora," I said, my voice weary, "you could have texted." "Is that Nora?" Elias's voice drifted from the kitchen, and it had changed. The sharp, supervisory edge was gone, replaced by a warm, resonant curiosity. He appeared in the doorway, a half-smile playing on his lips. "Nora, I thought you were in Cabo." "Cabo was a lifetime ago, Elias," she said, her voice dropping into a lower, more melodic register. She flashed him a look, a quick, bright thing that seemed to bypass me entirely. "I'm a refugee. Sarah's going to let me stay in the guest room for a few days, aren't you, Elle? Just until the plumber fixes the mess?" She looked at me then, but she called me Elle, the nickname Elias used for me when we were first married, before it shortened into just Sarah, and then eventually into silence. "Of course," Elias said, before I could speak. "The house is far too big for just the 2 of us anyway. It'll be good to have some life in the place." He walked over and took her suitcase from her hand. His fingers brushed hers. a brief, inconsequential contact. But I saw the way he didn't pull away immediately. He lingered for a fraction of a second too long. "I'll take this up," he said. "Sarah, why don't you get Nora some coffee? She looks like she's had a rough night." I stood in the hallway, watching my husband carry my sister's luggage up the stairs. I felt a strange, cold prickle at the base of my neck. It wasn't jealousy. Not yet. It was the feeling of a shift in the load-bearing walls of my life. For 25 years, I had been the only woman in this house. I had curated the silence, the comfort, and the order. In less than 5 minutes, Nora had dismantled it all. I went back into the kitchen. I reached for a third porcelain mug. My hand shook, just slightly, and the mug clinked against the marble island. The sound seemed to echo through the entire house. Psychologically, I knew what was happening. I had spent my life being the responsible one, the stabilizer. People like Elias and Nora don't love stabilizers. They use them. They rely on the foundation to stay still so they can dance on top of it. They assume the foundation doesn't have a breaking point because it has never groaned under the weight. Nora walked into the kitchen and sat in Elias's chair. She leaned her chin on her hand and watched me pour the coffee. "You've got a beautiful life here, Sarah," she said. Her voice was soft, but there was a jagged edge underneath it. "Everything is so perfect. I don't know how you do it. I'd go crazy with all this quiet." "You get used to it," I said, handing her the mug. "Or you learn to value it." "Elias seems happy," she mused, blowing steam off her coffee. "He's stayed in great shape. Most men his age have softened." "He works hard," I said. The silence that followed was heavy. I could hear Elias moving around upstairs, the floorboards creaking as he opened the guest room door. That room had been empty since our daughter Maya moved to the coast 3 years ago. I kept it dusted, the linens fresh and white, but I rarely went in there. It felt like a museum of a life that was already over. Elias came back down a few minutes later. He looked energized. He checked his watch, then looked at Nora. "I have to run to the office, but stay as long as you need. Sarah will get you settled." He turned to me, his expression shifting back into the neutral, distracted mask of a husband. "Don't forget about the coffee maker, Sarah, and make sure the guest towels are the Egyptian cotton ones. Nora has sensitive skin." He didn't kiss me goodbye. He hadn't for a long time. He simply nodded and left, the heavy front door closing with a solid, final thud. Nora looked at me over the rim of her mug. "He's right, you know. I do have sensitive skin." She smiled, but her eyes remained cold. I looked down at the coffee grounds in the sink. I realized then that I hadn't asked Nora how long she planned to stay, and she hadn't volunteered the information. That night, after dinner, a meal where Elias talked more than he had in months, regaling Nora with stories of his latest project while I cleared the plates, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Elias was already asleep, his breathing deep and rhythmic. The house was silent, except for the faint, distant sound of the ice machine in the kitchen. Then I heard it. A soft, muffled thud from the hallway. Then the sound of a door opening and closing very quietly. The guest room was at the end of the hall. Our room was in the center. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at the empty space beside me. Elias was still there. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, but the sound hadn't come from our door. It had come from the hallway. I walked to the bedroom door and cracked it open. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by the dim blue light of the security keypad. I looked toward the guest room. The door was closed, but a sliver of light was visible at the bottom. Then I heard a laugh. A low, melodic sound that I recognized instantly. Nora. And then another voice, hushed, deep. I retreated into my room and shut the door. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself that Elias was right here, sleeping. I reached out and touched his shoulder. He groaned softly and shifted, but he didn't wake. If Elias was in bed, who was in the guest room with my sister? I lay back down, but sleep didn't come. I realized that the silence I had spent 20 years protecting was no longer mine. It had been replaced by a different kind of quiet, the kind that hides a secret. The morning sun hit the breakfast nook at an angle that always felt intrusive. It highlighted the dust motes dancing in the air, particles of skin and fabric that I usually chased away with a damp microfiber cloth before Elias even opened his eyes. Today, however, the dust remained. I sat there, my fingers tracing the rim of a cold mug, listening to the house settle. Elias was in the shower. I could hear the hum of the high-pressure system, a steady drone that masked the sounds of the world. My mind kept returning to the previous night, the low, vibrating rumble of a man's voice in the guest room. I looked at the digital clock on the oven. 6:15. Nora appeared in the doorway, wearing a silk robe I hadn't seen before. It was a deep, bruised plum color, cinched tight at her waist. She looked luminous, her skin pale and dewy, lacking the sallow fatigue she usually carried after a crisis. "You're up early," she said, her voice scratchy with sleep. She walked to the counter and reached for the coffee pot, her movements fluid and entitled. "Did you sleep okay? I thought I heard you walking around last night." I watched her pour a cup. "I thought I heard voices," I said quietly. "From your room." Nora didn't flinch. She took a slow sip, her eyes meeting mine over the rim of the mug. They were the same shade of slate blue as mine, but where my eyes were tired, hers were hungry. "Oh, that was probably the television. I can't sleep in new places without the background noise. It makes the silence feel too heavy, don't you think?" "I like the silence," I said. "It's honest." "Silence is just a lack of data, Sarah," Nora replied, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. "It's what people use when they have something to hide." The shower stopped. A few minutes later, Elias walked into the kitchen. He was fastening his silver cufflinks, his movements precise. He stopped when he saw Nora, his posture shifting, shoulders back, chin slightly lifted. The landscape architect was back on duty, surveying his territory. "Nora, you look rested," Elias said. He turned to me, but his eyes didn't quite settle on my face. "Sarah, did you find those towels for the guest bathroom? The ones I mentioned?" "They're on the rack, Elias," I said. "The Egyptian cotton, just as you asked." "Good. Details matter, especially when we have a guest." He sat down at the island, tapping his tablet to wake it. "Nora, I was thinking about your apartment. I have a contractor who owes me a favor. I could have him go over there this afternoon and assess the water damage. We need to know exactly how long you'll be refugeeing with us." Nora leaned against the counter, placing herself directly in his line of sight. "That's so sweet, Elias, truly. But my landlord is being a total bear about the insurance. He won't even let me back in to get my mail yet. I'm stuck here, I'm afraid, a prisoner of your hospitality." Elias chuckled. It was a rich, warm sound that I hadn't heard in years, a sound he usually reserved for high-value clients or city council members. "A prisoner," she says. "Well, we'll try to make the sentence tolerable." I stood up and began to clear Nora's empty mug, even though she wasn't finished. I needed the physical movement to ground myself. As I reached for it, my hand brushed hers. Her skin was hot, almost feverish. "I'm going to go to the market," I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "We're low on the organic berries Elias likes for his smoothies." "Get the blackberries too. Nora added, not looking at me. I've always had a weakness for them. I left them there. In the driveway, I sat in my car for a full minute, staring at the closed garage door. I realized that in the span of 24 hours, the hierarchy of my home had been recalibrated. I was no longer the partner, I was the purveyor. I was the person who ensured the berries were fresh and the towels were soft, while they occupied the space of conversation. At the market, I moved through the aisles like a ghost. I found myself standing in front of the specialty cheeses, staring at a wedge of brie. Elias loved brie. I used to buy it every Friday for our date nights, even though those nights had eventually devolved into us sitting in the same room, him on his tablet and me with a book, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock. I didn't buy the brie. I bought the blackberries. When I returned, the house was empty. Elias had gone to the office, and Nora was nowhere to be seen. I put the groceries away with mechanical precision, each item placed in its designated spot. Then I walked up the stairs. The door to the guest room was slightly ajar. I knew I shouldn't go in. It was a violation of the very boundaries I prided myself on. But the memory of the voice from the night before, that deep, masculine rumble, was a splinter in my mind. I pushed the door open. The room smelled of her jasmine perfume, but there was something else underneath it. Something sharper. The scent of a man's cologne. It wasn't the sandalwood Elias wore. It was something heavier, more aggressive. Tobacco and citrus. The bed was made, but not in the way I did it. The pillows were stacked haphazardly. On the nightstand sat a small, leather-bound notebook and a discarded tie. I picked up the tie. It was silk, a deep emerald green. It wasn't Elias's. Elias only wore blues, grays, and blacks. He called green unprofessional. I felt a surge of nausea. If this tie didn't belong to Elias, then Nora had brought a man into our house on her very first night. A man she had hidden. A man who had laughed with her while my husband slept inches away from me. I dropped the tie as if it were burning. I walked to the window and looked out at the backyard. Below, I saw Elias. He wasn't at the office. He was in the garden, standing by the fountain he had designed 3 years ago. He was talking to Nora. She was laughing, her hand resting lightly on his forearm. He was looking at her with an intensity that made my breath catch. It wasn't the look of a brother-in-law. It was the look of a man seeing a beautiful garden for the first time, wondering how he could claim it. And then he reached out. He didn't pull away. He tucked a stray lock of her hair behind her ear. It was a gesture of such profound intimacy that it felt more violent than a blow. I backed away from the window, my heart thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Psychologically, I knew what was happening. I was witnessing the beginning of an erasure. Elias didn't want to destroy me. He wanted to replace me with a version of the world that was more vibrant, more demanding, and less familiar. And Nora was the perfect tool for that. She had always been the one who took what she wanted, leaving me to mend the seams. I heard the back door open. I heard their voices, bright, synchronized, and exclude me. "I think the hydrangeas would look better over by the stone wall," Nora was saying. "They need more drama, Elias. Everything in this garden is so polite." "Drama," Elias repeated, his voice thoughtful. "Yes, I suppose you're right. I've focused too much on the symmetry." I sat on the edge of the guest bed, my hands folded in my lap. I looked at the emerald tie on the floor. The question wasn't just who the man in the guest room was. The question was why Nora was playing this game. She was flirting with Elias in the sunlight, while keeping a secret in the dark. I realized then that I wasn't just a foundation. I was an observer in a house that was being remodeled while I was still living in it. I stood up and walked to the door, closing it softly behind me. I went down to the kitchen and began to prep the blackberries. I rinsed them under the cold water, watching the dark juice stain the white porcelain sink. When they walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, I was smiling. It was the fake, hollow smile of a woman who had spent 20 years learning how to hide her heart. "The berries are ready," I said, my voice level. "I thought we could have them with some cream." Elias looked at me, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of guilt. Or perhaps it was just annoyance that I had interrupted the flow of his new drama. "That sounds nice, Sarah," he said. Nora walked over and picked up a blackberry, popping it into her mouth. She stained her lips with the dark juice and grinned at me. "You always did know exactly what I needed, Elle," she said. I looked at the clock. It was only 2 in the afternoon. The day felt like it had been going on for years. And the night was coming, and with it, the voices in the next room. I reached for the cream, but as I did, I noticed a small bruise on Nora's neck, just below the jawline. It was fresh. It wasn't the shape of a man's fingers. It was the shape of a bite. My husband stood 5 feet away, his back to us, checking his email. I felt the first crack in my own foundation. It was a cold, silent split, and I knew that once it started, the entire structure was destined to fall. The bruise on Nora's neck seemed to pulse in time with the ticking of the kitchen clock. It was a dark, angry plum color, partially obscured by the collar of her robe, but unmistakable to an eye trained to notice the slightest deviation in a room's arrangement. I sat across from her, pushing a piece of dry toast around my plate. Elias was engrossed in his tablet, the blue light reflecting off his glasses, making him look like an artificial construct of a man. "You should put some ice on that, Nora," I said. My voice was thin, like a wire stretched to its breaking point. Nora's hand flew to her throat, her fingers splaying over the mark. For a second, her composure wavered, a hairline fracture in the porcelain. "On what?" "Your neck. It looks like you had an accident." Elias looked up then. His gaze moved from me to Nora. I watched his eyes. I searched for the flicker of recognition, the telltale heat of a man looking at his own handiwork, but his expression was one of mild, clinical curiosity. "A bruise?" Elias asked. He leaned in, peering at her neck with the same detached interest he gave to a blight on a boxwood hedge. "You must have bumped it when we were moving your luggage, Nora. The hallway is narrow. I told you to be careful with those heavy cases." "Right," Nora said, her voice regaining its melodic lilt. She laughed, a sound like silver coins falling onto marble. "I'm so clumsy, Elias. Always have been. Sarah was the one who never fell, never bruised. I was the one always covered in Band-Aids." "Symmetry is rare in nature," Elias mused, returning to his screen. "Sarah is the exception. She's remarkably sturdy." Sturdy. The word felt like a slap. One does not love something that is sturdy. One relies on it, like a foundation or a load-bearing wall. One saves their passion for the delicate things, the things that can be bruised, the things that require care. "I found a tie in the guest room," I said. I didn't look at either of them. I kept my eyes on the crumbs on my plate. "An emerald green one. It's silk. High quality." The silence that followed was different from the silence of the morning. This was a dense, airless thing. I felt Nora's gaze on the side of my face, sharp and speculative. "A tie?" Nora asked. "Oh, that. It must have belonged to Marcus, my ex. I must have packed it by mistake. I was in such a rush to leave the apartment. I just shoveled things into the suitcase. I should probably throw it away. It's just clutter. I thought Elias said green was unprofessional, I said, finally looking at my husband. Elias didn't blink. It is. It's a chaotic color. It lacks the authority of navy or the sobriety of gray. He paused, his thumb hovering over the tablet. Why haven't you put it in the bin then, Sarah? If it's clutter, it doesn't belong in this house. The dismissal was so complete it left me breathless. He wasn't just telling me to throw away a tie. He was telling me to stop observing, to stop recording, to return to my role as the silent maintainer of his environment. Psychologically, I understood the maneuver. By treating my observation as a chore I had failed to complete, he was reasserting his dominance. He was reminding me that in this house, facts are only facts if he acknowledges them. Anything else is just dust for me to sweep away. In the afternoon, I went to the study to file the utility bills. The study is Elias's sanctuary, a room of dark wood, leather-bound books, and the faint lingering scent of his expensive tobacco. I rarely spend time here unless I'm cleaning, but today the room felt different. It felt occupied. I sat at his desk, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I didn't have his password, but I didn't need it. I was looking for something physical. I opened the bottom drawer, the one where he kept the historical blueprints of the estates he'd designed. Tucked behind a rolled-up vellum map of the Sterling estate was a small velvet box. I opened it. Inside was a pair of earrings, emeralds. They were deep, mossy stones, surrounded by a halo of small diamonds. They were beautiful, and they were entirely wrong. Elias had given me pearls for our 20th anniversary. He said pearls were timeless and unobtrusive. He said I was a woman who didn't need to scream for attention. These emeralds screamed. I closed the box and put it back exactly where I found it. I aligned the vellum map to the millimeter. My heart was a dull, heavy thud in my chest. If the emerald tie belonged to Nora's ex, why did my husband have a matching set of emerald earrings hidden in his desk? I walked out of the study and found Nora in the sunroom. She was reading a magazine, her legs draped over the arm of the chair. She looked up and smiled, a slow, predatory expression. "You look tired, Sarah," she said. "You've been working so hard since I got here. You should take a nap. Elias and I were thinking of going for a drive later to look at the new Arboretum site. You probably wouldn't enjoy it, all that walking and technical talk." "I'd like to go," I said. Nora's smile didn't falter, but her eyes darkened. "Are you sure? You mentioned your back was bothering you this morning, and someone needs to be here for the grocery delivery, right? We're out of that fancy mineral water Elias likes." "I'll reschedule the delivery," I said. The escalation was subtle, but it was there. Nora wasn't just a guest anymore, she was a gatekeeper. She was testing the perimeter of my influence, seeing how much of my own life she could occupy before I pushed back. And she was doing it with the effortless grace of someone who knows she has the backing of the person in charge. When Elias came home at 5, Nora met him at the door. I stayed in the kitchen, listening. "Elias, Sarah wants to come to the Arboretum," Nora said. Her voice was light, but she emphasized my name in a way that made it sound like a burden. "I told her she should rest, but she's being so stubborn." "Sarah," Elias called out. He didn't come into the kitchen. He spoke from the foyer, his voice echoing. "If you're not feeling well, don't force it. The Arboretum will still be there next week. Stay home. Have a quiet evening. We won't be long." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order, dressed in the fake finery of concern. "I'm fine, Elias," I said, walking into the hallway. He looked at me then. His eyes were cold, 2 chips of flint. He looked at my hair, which I hadn't done properly, and my sweater, which was an old, comfortable thing I wore for chores. Then he looked at Nora, who was radiant in a tailored trench coat and a silk scarf. "You look like you need the rest, Sarah," he said. "Please, don't make this difficult. We're going." He turned and walked out the door. Nora followed him, but before she stepped out, she looked back at me. She didn't say anything. She just touched the bruise on her neck and winked. The door closed. The house fell into that heavy, suffocating silence. I stood in the foyer for a long time. I looked at the grandfather clock. 5:15. I went to the guest room. I didn't hesitate this time. I walked to the closet and pulled out Nora's suitcase. I began to go through it. I wasn't looking for clothes. I was looking for the man Nora had brought into my house. At the bottom of the case, tucked into a hidden pocket, I found a burner phone. It was vibrating. I picked it up. There was one unread message. "Is the sturdy one asleep yet? I want to hear you scream my name again." The message wasn't from a contact name. It was just a number. I looked at the number. My breath hitched. I knew that number. It wasn't Elias's work phone or his personal cell. It was the number for the landline in Elias's study, the private line he used for sensitive client calls, the line he told me never to answer. I sat on the guest bed, the burner phone cold in my hand. I realized then that the man in the guest room wasn't a stranger. He was the man who slept beside me every night. But he wasn't my husband. Elias was a stranger who had been living in my house for 20 years, building a world that I was never meant to be a part of. And then, I heard the garage door open. They were back early. I scrambled to put the phone back, but as I moved, I knocked over the nightstand lamp. It shattered on the hardwood floor, a sharp, violent sound that cut through the silence like a scream. I heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy, fast. "Sarah?" Elias's voice was like thunder. "What are you doing in there?" I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by broken glass, holding my sister's burner phone. The curiosity hook was no longer a hook. It was a noose. The glass lay on the hardwood like a constellation of jagged stars. I stood frozen, the burner phone a heavy, vibrating secret in my pocket. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, panicked thud that seemed to echo in the small room. Elias appeared in the doorway. He didn't rush to me. He didn't ask if I was cut. He stood perfectly still, his eyes sweeping over the room with the clinical detachment of a man surveying a storm-damaged garden. His gaze settled on the broken lamp, then moved slowly up to my face. "What are you doing in here, Sarah?" he asked. His voice was dangerously quiet, a low vibration that made the hair on my arms stand up. I was checking the linens," I said. My voice sounded thin, a stranger's voice. "I tripped. The rug must have slipped." Nora appeared behind him, her face a mask of wide-eyed concern that didn't reach her cold, slate-blue eyes. She leaned into Elias's shoulder, a gesture so natural it made my stomach churn. "Oh, Sarah, are you okay? That lamp was an antique. Elias spent months finding the right base for this room." "It's just glass, Nora," Elias said, though his tone suggested it was much more than that. He stepped into the room, bypassing me to look at the nightstand. "The rug is perfectly straight, Sarah. You've never been clumsy. Not in 25 years. "I'm tired, Elias," I said, backing toward the door. "Like you said, I should have stayed in bed." "Yes," he replied, finally looking at me. His eyes were like two pieces of polished flint. "You should have. Now you've made a mess that someone else has to clean up. Go to the kitchen. I'll handle the glass. I don't want Nora cutting her feet because of your exhaustion." I walked past them, my shoulder brushing Elias's suit jacket. He didn't move to let me through. I felt the heat radiating from him, a controlled, silent fury. As I descended the stairs, I heard him speak to Nora in a tone I hadn't heard in a decade, soft, protective, and intimate. "Don't come in yet, Nora. Stay in the hall. I'll make sure it's safe for you." I reached the kitchen and sank into a chair. My hands were shaking so violently, I had to tuck them under my thighs. I felt the weight of the burner phone in my pocket. It was a ticking bomb. I realized then that my sturdiness, the very quality Elias praised when it served him, was now a liability. Because I was sturdy, I was expected to absorb the impact of their betrayal without cracking. Because I was sturdy, I was supposed to be invisible. Psychologically, I saw the cage they were building. They weren't just having an affair, they were restructuring the reality of the house. In their version of the world, I was the failing, clumsy wife who couldn't be trusted with the delicate things. It was a gaslighting so subtle it felt like oxygen. I pulled the phone out and looked at the screen. The message was still there. "I want to hear you scream my name again." I looked at the number again. The study landline. A memory surfaced, sharp and painful. 6 months ago, Elias had started locking the study. He told me he was working on a high-security government contract for a new coastal park. He said the blueprints were confidential. I had accepted it, as I accepted everything, because I believed in the sanctity of his work. I had spent 6 months bringing him trays of sandwiches and tea, leaving them outside a locked door, while he was inside, calling my sister. The flood in Nora's apartment wasn't an accident. It was a move. Dinner that night was an exercise in systematic exclusion. Elias had ordered Italian from the place Nora liked, the one that used too much garlic and oil. Flavors he usually claimed were uncultured. He hadn't asked me what I wanted. He hadn't even set a place for me. When I entered the dining room, they were already eating. They were sharing a bottle of red wine, the deep crimson liquid staining their glasses. "Oh, Sarah," Nora said, wiping a bit of oil from her lip. "We thought you were napping. There's a container in the kitchen if you're hungry." "I'll eat later," I said, standing by the sideboard. I began to rearrange the silver candlesticks, a nervous habit. "Stop hovering, Sarah," Elias said without looking up. "It's distracting. Nora is telling me about her time in Milan. It's fascinating. She has an eye for spatial harmony that most of my junior architects lack." "I was just thinking," Nora said, leaning toward him, "that the terrace needs more than just stone. It needs movement. Potted citrus, perhaps? Something with scent." "Citrus is difficult in this climate," Elias mused, but he was smiling. "But for you, I think we could make it work. I'll have to redesign the irrigation." "You already have so much work, Elias," I interrupted. "The Henderson Project." "The Henderson Project is under control," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut. "I don't need you to manage my calendar, Sarah. I need you to manage the house. Speaking of which, the guest room smells of lavender. Nora prefers eucalyptus. See to it tomorrow, will you?" I looked at my sister. She was wearing the emerald earrings. They caught the light of the chandelier, flashing a brilliant, mocking green. She hadn't even waited for me to leave the room to put them on. She was wearing my husband's gift, eating my husband's food, sitting in my house and telling me to change the scent of her room. "Those are beautiful earrings, Nora," I said. Nora touched one of the stones, her smile widening. "Aren't they?" "A welcome home gift from an old friend. He knows I have a weakness for green." "A very generous friend," I said, looking at Elias. He didn't flinch. He took a slow sip of his wine, his eyes fixed on Nora's throat. "Value is subjective, Sarah. Some things are worth the investment. Others? Well, others just take up space. The neglect wasn't a byproduct of their attraction. It was the point. They were enjoying the act of erasing me in my own presence. It was a psychological feast, and I was the main course. That night, I didn't go to the guest room to spy. I didn't need to. I stayed in our bed, lying perfectly still. Elias came in late. He didn't turn on the light. He stripped off his clothes and climbed into bed, leaving a vast, cold desert of space between us. He smelled of jasmine and tobacco. I waited until his breathing slowed, until I was sure he was asleep. Then, I reached out and gently touched his forearm. His skin was hot. "Elias?" I whispered. He didn't wake, but he muttered something in his sleep. A name. Not Sarah, not Nora. "Maya," he breathed. I froze. Maya. Our daughter. Why was he saying her name? Maya hadn't called in months. She had become distant, her voice strained during our brief Sunday chats. She had always been Daddy's girl, the one he spent hours with in the garden, teaching her the names of the trees while I watched from the window. A new fear, colder and deeper than the affair, settled in my chest. I got out of bed and walked to the hallway. I didn't go to the guest room. I went to the study. The door was locked, as usual. I knelt down and pressed my ear to the wood. The silence was absolute. But as I turned to leave, I saw something caught in the doorframe. A small white slip of paper. A receipt. I picked it up. It was from a florist in the city where Maya lived. It was dated last week. 1 dozen white lilies. Message. Thinking of our secret place. See you soon. E. White lilies. The flowers of the dead. Or the flowers of a wedding. Elias didn't like lilies. He called them funeral weeds. I tucked the receipt into my pocket, alongside the burner phone. I realized that the house I had spent 25 years maintaining was not a sanctuary. It was a labyrinth of secrets, and I was the only one who didn't have a map. I looked toward the guest room. The door was slightly ajar. Nora was standing in the darkness of the hallway, watching me. She was as silent as a ghost, her pale face illuminated by the moon. "Looking for something, Sarah?" she whispered. The hallway felt like a tunnel, with the air sucked out of it. Nora stood just outside the guest room door, the moonlight catching the silk of her plum robe, making her look like a dark stain against the white wainscoting. She didn't move. She didn't even seem to breathe. "You're wandering again, Sarah," she said. Her voice was a low, melodic rasp that carried perfectly in the still house. "Is the bed too big without Elias? Or is it just too quiet?" I stayed by the study door, the florist's receipt crinkling in my pocket. I thought I heard something. The house is old. It settles. Nora took a slow step toward me. The scent of her jasmine perfume was thick, cloying, a floral shroud. "It's not the house that's settling, Elle. It's you. You've spent so long being the foundation that you've forgotten how to move. You're just stuck." She reached out, her fingers grazing my arm. Her touch was icy. "Go back to bed. You look like a ghost. If you keep this up, Elias is going to start worrying about your mental state. And we wouldn't want that, would we?" The threat was wrapped in the softest silk of sisterly concern. Psychologically, I knew what she was doing. She was laying the groundwork for my obsolescence. If I was unstable, my observations didn't matter. My pain was just a symptom. My presence was just a problem to be managed. "I'm not a ghost, Nora," I said, my voice steady despite the roar of blood in my ears. "I'm the person who owns this house." Nora's smile didn't reach her eyes. For now. I walked past her, the burner phone in my other pocket, feeling like a lead weight. I didn't go back to Elias's bed. I went to the small sewing room at the end of the hall and locked the door. I sat in the darkness, surrounded by the skeletal shapes of dress forms and half-finished projects, and waited for the sun. The next morning, the exclusion became a physical barrier. When I entered the kitchen at 7, the smell of frying bacon and expensive coffee hit me. But it wasn't my routine. Nora was at the stove, wearing one of my aprons, a white linen one with my initials embroidered on the pocket. Elias was at the island, his laptop closed for once. He was watching her move with an expression of rapt, hungry attention. "Morning, Sarah," Elias said. He didn't look at me. He was watching the way Nora flipped the bacon.
Nora insisted on making her famous breakfast. I told her you usually handle things, but she said you looked like you needed a morning off. I've already set the table on the terrace, Nora chirped, sliding the bacon onto a plate with practiced ease. It's such a beautiful morning. The light is perfect for the garden. I looked at the counter. My porcelain mugs had been pushed aside, replaced by a set of mismatched, colorful ceramic cups Nora must have brought with her. The order I had spent decades perfecting was being systematically dismantled, replaced by a calculated, vibrant chaos. I usually descale the machine on Wednesdays, I said, my voice sounding small in the bright kitchen. I did it already, Nora said, turning to me with a brilliant, empty smile. I found the vinegar under the sink. You really shouldn't let it get so grimy, Elle. Elias says the coffee has tasted metallic for weeks. Elias nodded, taking a sip from one of the new mugs. She's right. This is much better, clearer. He hadn't mentioned the taste to me. He had simply waited for a different woman to fix it, so he could use it as a point of comparison. The neglect was no longer passive. It was becoming a performance. I sat down, but I didn't eat. I watched them. They spoke in the shorthand of people who share a secret language, technical terms about spatial flow and botanical textures, mixed with low-voiced jokes I didn't understand. I was a spectator at my own table. I have to go into the city today, Elias said, wiping his mouth. Nora is coming with me. She wants to see the nursery we use for the high-end projects. She thinks my current palette is too safe. Safe? I asked. You've always said your style was principled. Principles can become ruts, Sarah, Elias said, his eyes finally meeting mine. They were cold, devoid of the 25 years we had shared. Nora has a perspective I've been lacking. She sees the drama in the landscape. She sees the life. He stood up, checking his silver watch. We'll be back late. Don't wait up. And Sarah, the silver in the dining room looks a bit dull. Since you have the day to yourself, perhaps you could see to it? The command was a dismissal. He was assigning me chores to keep me occupied, to keep me in the role of the sturdy servant while he and my sister went out to play at being partners. As they walked toward the garage, I watched them from the kitchen window. Elias opened the car door for her, a gesture he hadn't performed for me since our honeymoon. Nora leaned in and said something that made him throw his head back and laugh. It was a beautiful, terrifying sound. I waited until I heard the engine fade before I pulled the florist's receipt from my pocket. White lilies. Thinking of our secret place. See you soon. E. The E was for Elias. But who were the lilies for? He had muttered Maya in his sleep. Our daughter who lived 3 hours away? Our daughter who had stopped calling me, but was apparently receiving flowers from her father with messages about secret places. I went to the study. I didn't try the door, I knew it was locked. Instead, I went outside to the terrace.
Elias is a master of hidden structures. He designed the study with a private entrance, a set of French doors that lead to a small, secluded courtyard. He told me it was for client privacy. I had never used it. I found the spare key hidden inside a hollowed-out stone near the fountain. My hands shook as I fitted into the lock. The door groaned softly, then opened. The study felt like a tomb. It was cold, the air smelling of stale tobacco and that sharp citrus cologne I'd smelled in the guest room. I moved to the desk. It was immaculate. No papers, no blueprints, just a clean, dark surface. I opened the laptop on the desk. It was password protected, but Elias is a man of habit. I tried our wedding anniversary. Incorrect. I tried Maya's birthday. Incorrect. I tried the date he had won the National Landscape Award, the day he always said was the true beginning of his life. The screen flickered to life. I didn't look at his emails. I went straight to the browser history. There were dozens of searches for flights to the coast, searches for private estate rentals, and then a series of emails to a law firm I didn't recognize. The subject line: trust dissolution and transfer of assets. I opened the most recent one. Dear Mr. Sterling, as requested, the documents for the transfer of the Sterling Family Trust to the sole beneficiary, Maya Sterling, are ready for signature. Please note that this will effectively bypass the spousal contingency clause as discussed. My breath hitched. The trust was my security. It was the money my own parents had contributed to help Elias start his firm. He was moving it. He was giving it to Maya. But why? Why would Maya agree to this? I scrolled further down. There was an attachment, a photo. I clicked on it, and the world seemed to tilt. It was a photo of Elias and Maya. They were at a restaurant I didn't recognize. They were leaning in close, smiling. But it wasn't the smile of a father and daughter. Maya was wearing the emerald necklace, the one that matched the earrings Nora was currently wearing. And in the background, partially obscured but unmistakable, was Nora. She was holding the camera, her reflection caught in a mirror. They were all there, without me. The secret place wasn't a location. It was a life. A life they had all built together while I was busy descaling the coffee maker and polishing the silver. My husband, my sister, and my daughter. I heard the sound of a car in the driveway. They were back early. I scrambled to close the laptop and exit through the French doors. I barely managed to lock the stone and get back to the kitchen before the front door opened. Sarah? Elias's voice boomed through the house. Why is the sewing room locked? And why haven't you started the silver? I stood at the sink, my hands plunged into cold water. I realized then that I wasn't just being replaced. I was being liquidated. My family was a cartel, and I was the asset they were stripping bare. Nora walked into the kitchen looking flushed and triumphant. She walked straight to the fridge and pulled out a bottle of wine. We decided to celebrate, Elle, she said, her voice dripping with a predatory sweetness. Elias got the confirmation on the coastal project. We're all going down there next week to see the site. Even Maya is meeting us. She paused, looking at me with those cold slate eyes. I'd invite you, but someone needs to stay here and oversee the painters. Elias wants the house neutral before the changes. Changes? I asked. Elias walked in, his eyes hard and certain. We're putting the house on the market, Sarah. It's too big, too quiet. It's time for a clean slate. He stepped toward me, his presence looming, suffocating. I've already signed the papers. You'll need to start packing your things. The sturdy things. The things that can survive a move. He smiled, but it was the smile of a predator who has finally cornered its prey. I looked at the burner phone in my pocket. I looked at the receipt. I realized I had a choice. I could be the foundation that collapsed,
or I could be the one who pulled the pin on the whole structure. "I'll start packing," I said quietly. Elias nodded, satisfied. He turned to Nora. "See? I told you she'd be reasonable. She always is." But as they walked away, I felt something new. Not pain, not betrayal. It was a cold, sharp clarity. They thought they were the architects. They forgot that I was the one who knew where all the pipes were buried, and I was about to turn off the water. The smell of Swiss coffee paint is thick and cloying, a sterile chemical scent that promises a fresh start by burying everything beneath it. The painters arrived at 8 o'clock, 3 men in white overalls who moved through my home with the efficient indifference of coroners. They didn't ask about the memories attached to the soft sage green in the dining room or the warm apricot in the hallway. They simply draped heavy canvas drop cloths over my furniture, turning my life into a series of lumpy, white ghosts. Elias and Nora had left an hour earlier. I watched from the darkened window of the sewing room as Elias loaded Nora's smaller bags into the trunk of his silver sedan. He was wearing a casual linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up, looking like a man on the verge of a holiday. Nora was dressed in a vibrant yellow sundress that made her look like a splash of paint against the gray morning. "Don't forget the painters, Sarah," Elias had said, sticking his head into the sewing room before leaving. He didn't come inside. He stood at the threshold, his hand on the frame, as if afraid the room's stagnant air might stain him. "The lead guy, Mike, has the color codes. Just make sure they don't miss the trim in the study. And for God's sake, keep the kitchen tidy. We might have a walkthrough as early as Friday." "Friday," I repeated. "That's fast." "Market's hot," he said with a shrug. "And this house, it's an asset that's reached its peak. It's time to liquidate." Liquidate. He spoke of our home, the place where we raised Maya, where we celebrated 25 Christmases, as if it were a failing stock. After they left, the silence of the house was replaced by the rhythmic shloop-shloop of rollers and the occasional muffled grunt of the men at work. I felt like a trespasser in my own hallways. I retreated to the kitchen to make tea, but the painters had already taped off the cabinets with blue painter's tape. I sat at the small kitchen table, the only piece of furniture not covered in canvas, and pulled out my phone. I dialed Maya. It rang 4 times before she picked up. "Mom, I'm kind of in the middle of something," Maya said. Her voice was sharp, clipped, the exact cadence Elias used when he was managing a subordinate. "I just wanted to hear your voice, Maya. Your father said you're meeting them at the coast." There was a long pause. I could hear the sound of the ocean in the background, a low, rhythmic sigh. "Yeah, we're looking at the site for the new project. Dad's really excited about it. It's a huge opportunity for the firm." "And for you?" I asked. "It's a future, Mom," she said, and there was a sudden defensive edge to her tone. "Everything here is so stagnant. You and Dad haven't really been together in years. Everyone knows it. Nora says you'll be happier with a smaller place, something easier to maintain." Nora says. The words felt like a cold blade between my ribs. "Maya, have you seen the documents for the trust?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The ones that transfer everything to you?" "Dad mentioned it," she said, her voice flattening. "He said it was to protect the family legacy." "Look, I have to go. The architect is here. I'll call you when I can, okay?" She hung up before I could say, "I love you." I stared at the phone. Psychologically, the betrayal by a child is different than the betrayal by a spouse. With Elias, it was a slow erosion of respect, a crumbling of a contract. But with Maya, it felt like a biological failure. I had spent 21 years as her primary orbit, the person who knew her favorite soup and the exact way she liked her pillows fluffed. Now, I was being edited out of her life like a typo. I went to the pantry and reached for my purse. I needed to leave, to breathe air that didn't smell like wet paint. I reached for my wallet to find my debit card, but when I opened the leather flap, it was gone. I checked the side pockets. I checked the floor. My credit cards were there, but the primary bank card, the one linked to our joint household account, was missing. I pulled out the burner phone I'd taken from Nora's room. I looked at the most recent messages. The card is secure. She won't be able to make any large withdrawals before the house sells. You're so thorough, Elias. It's a turn-on. Does the sturdy one have enough for groceries? She has the credit card. I'll settle the balance once the trust transfer is finalized. She doesn't need cash for silence. I sat on the floor of the pantry, surrounded by cans of soup and boxes of pasta. He had neutered me financially. He was keeping me on a leash made of credit limits and allowances, ensuring I couldn't run, couldn't hire a lawyer, and couldn't interfere with the sale of the house. The front door opened. The painters looked up as Elias walked back in. He was alone. "Forgot the site surveys," he muttered, walking toward the study. He saw me sitting on the pantry floor. He stopped, his eyes flicking from my face to the open purse in my lap. "Lost something, Sarah?" he asked. "My debit card, Elias. I can't find it." He didn't blink. He didn't offer to help. He simply leaned against the doorframe, a look of cold, weary patience on his face. I took it. I noticed some unusual activity on the account, subscriptions I didn't authorize. I decided it was best to consolidate everything into a single managed account until the move is over. You have the visa for essentials. Unusual activity? I stood up, my legs trembling. Elias, I haven't bought anything but groceries in 3 months. Your memory has been a bit porous lately, Sarah. The broken lamp, the wandering at night. I'm just trying to simplify things for you. You should be thanking me. He stepped toward me, and for the first time, I saw the mask slip. The refined architect vanished, replaced by something jagged and sharp. He grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging into the flesh. It wasn't a violent shake, but a slow, crushing pressure. "Don't make this a thing, Sarah," he hissed, his breath smelling of the peppermint he used to mask the tobacco. "I'm building a world for our daughter. I'm building a legacy. If you can't be a part of the solution, then stay out of the way. Do you understand?" I looked at his hand on my arm. I looked at the cold, calculating monster behind his eyes. This was the man I had loved. This was the man I had sacrificed my own career for so he could have the spatial harmony he required. "You're hurting me, Elias," I said quietly. He looked down at his hand as if it belonged to someone else. He released me, but he didn't apologize. He adjusted his cuff, the silver link glinting in the harsh light of the kitchen. "You're too soft, Sarah. You always were. That's why you need a foundation. Without me, you'd just dissolve." He grabbed his surveys from the study and left. I stood in the kitchen, watching the red marks on my arm fade to a dull, throbbing white. I realized then that the monster wasn't just a metaphor. Elias didn't just want to leave me. He wanted to break me so thoroughly that I wouldn't even know how to complain about the pieces. The painters were watching me. Mike, the lead guy, looked away quickly, his face flushed with the discomfort of a stranger witnessing a private humiliation. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm fine, Mike," I said. "Please, just keep painting. I want it to be perfectly neutral." I went to the basement.
It was the only part of the house not being painted, a damp, cool space filled with the detritus of 20 years. I went to the old workbench where Elias used to keep his tools before he grew too successful to work with his hands. Underneath a pile of old gardening tarps was a small, locked metal box. Elias thought the key was in the study. He didn't know I had a copy hidden inside the base of the ceramic planter on the porch, the one with the dead hydrangeas he told me to throw away. I opened the box.
Inside wasn't money. It was evidence. 15 years ago, Elias had been involved in a spatial dispute regarding a city park. A structural failure in a retaining wall had led to an injury. Elias had blamed the contractor, but I had seen the original blueprints. I had seen the calculation error he had made in his own hand. I had kept the original vellum, the one he thought he'd shredded. I held the vellum in my hands. It was thin, fragile, but it was the one thing Elias feared more than a failed marriage, a failed reputation. But as I looked at the blueprints, I noticed something else in the box. A small velvet pouch I hadn't seen before. I opened it. Inside was a key to a safe deposit box at a bank in the city, and a folded note in Nora's handwriting. Elias, the sturdy one is starting to look. We need to move the date up. The coastal project won't wait, and neither will I. Maya is ready. Are you? The date on the note was yesterday. I realized then that the trip to the coast wasn't just a site visit. It was the departure. They weren't coming back to this house. They were leaving me here with the painters and the neutral walls while they started their new life with the trust money. I looked at the vellum. I looked at the key. I wasn't going to turn off the water. I was going to flood the entire valley. The painters were moving into the master bedroom. I could hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of furniture being dragged across the floor. The mahogany dresser I'd polished every month, the cedar chest that held my wedding veil, the armchair where I'd sat while nursing Maya. Everything was being repositioned for the convenience of the rollers. The house was no longer a home. It was a series of surfaces to be covered. "We're doing the trim in the hallway now, Mrs. Sterling," Mike, the lead painter, said. He was standing in the kitchen looking at me with a pained expression. He was holding a roll of blue tape like a weapon he didn't know how to use. "You might want to stay in one of the back rooms. The fumes are getting pretty heavy." "Thank you, Mike," I said. I was standing at the counter, my fingers tracing the faint, yellowish-green bruise on my forearm. The skin felt tight, a physical record of Elias's clarity. I saw the silver car pull out earlier," Mike added, his voice dropping. Mr. Sterling looked like he was in a hurry. He didn't say when he'd be back. "He's at the coast," I said. "Building a future." Mike lingered for a second, his eyes flicking to the bruise. He opened his mouth as if to say something, to offer a phone, a ride, a witness. But the heavy silence of the house seemed to push the words back down his throat. He just nodded and went back to his tape. Psychologically, the isolation was becoming a physical barrier. Elias hadn't locked me in a room. He had simply locked the world out. By taking my card, by telling the painters I was porous, by aligning Nora and Maya against me, he had created a vacuum where my voice had no medium to travel through. I went to the mudroom and found my old gardening boots. I slipped them on and walked out the back door, staying low so I wouldn't be seen from the upstairs windows where the painters were working. I needed to get to the bank in the city. The safe deposit box key was burning a hole in my pocket. The silver sedan was gone, but the old station wagon, the one Elias called an eyesore and used for hauling mulch, was parked behind the shed. I found the keys in the magnetic box under the wheel well, just where I'd hidden them 3 years ago when Maya was learning to drive. The engine groaned, a rusty, coughing sound that made my heart race, but it caught. I drove down the long, winding driveway, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I felt like an escapee. The city was an hour away. As I drove, the neutral colors of the suburbs gave way to the jagged, gray reality of the industrial district. I pulled into the parking lot of the First National Bank, a cold, imposing building of granite and glass. Inside, the air was chilled and smelled of paper and old money. I walked to the vault counter. The clerk, a woman in her 60s with spectacles hanging from a gold chain, looked at my gardening boots and my frayed sweater with a flicker of polite disdain. "I have a key for box 402, I said, sliding the silver key across the marble. "The name is Sterling. Elias or Sarah?" She checked the ledger. "The box is registered to Elias Sterling and Nora Vance," she said. Her voice was flat, professional. The name hit me like a physical blow. Nora. He hadn't put me on the box. He had put my sister. I'm Mrs. Sterling," I said, my voice wavering. "I have the key. He sent me to retrieve documents for the coastal project." The clerk looked at me, her eyes narrowing behind her lenses. She saw the bruise on my arm, the one I'd forgotten to cover. Her expression shifted. It wasn't pity. It was a cold, sharp recognition. "Just a moment," she said. She went into a back office. I stood at the counter, the silence of the bank pressing in on me. I expected her to return with security. I expected Elias to walk through the door, his hand reaching for my arm. Instead, she returned with a signature card. "Sign here, Mrs. Sterling." She led me into the vault. The heavy steel door swung open with a silent, terrifying grace. She pointed to a small, rectangular door. "I'll leave you for 5 minutes." I fit the key into the lock. My breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. The box slid out with a metallic screech. Inside was a thick manila envelope and a small velvet bag. I opened the bag first. It wasn't the emeralds. It was a set of gold bands, Elias's and mine. He had taken our original wedding rings and put them in a box with Nora's name on it. It was a ritual of replacement, so complete, it felt surgical. I opened the envelope. There were the trust documents I'd seen on the laptop, already signed by Elias and notarized. But there was something else. A life insurance policy. I scanned the pages. It was a policy for $3 million. The beneficiary was Maya Sterling. The insured was me. But the date of the policy was only 2 weeks old, and the medical examiner's signature on the physical exam form was a name I didn't recognize. I hadn't had a physical in 2 years. Elias hadn't just moved the money. He had bet on my death. Psychologically, the monster had evolved. He didn't just want me gone so he could be with Nora. He wanted my absence to be the final capital injection for his legacy. If I died, the trust transfer became untouchable, the house sale became a probate matter he could control, and the $3 million would ensure Maya and Nora never had to work a day in their lives. I felt a cold, liquid terror settle in my gut. Thinking of our secret place. See you soon. The secret place wasn't a site visit. It was a destination for me. I heard the vault door creak. The clerk was standing there. "Are you finished, Mrs. Sterling?" she asked. Her voice was soft now, almost urgent. "You should go. The other account holder called 10 minutes ago to check the status of the box. He's on his way." "Thank you," I whispered. I shoved the envelope into my sweater and practically ran to the car. I drove away from the bank, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, expecting to see the silver sedan at every intersection. I pulled into a diner 5 miles away, a greasy, anonymous place with cracked vinyl booths.
I sat in the corner and pulled out the burner phone. There was a new message from Elias. Sarah isn't at the house. Mike said she took the wagon. She's looking, Nora. I told you she was getting porous. It doesn't matter. The appointment is for tonight. Just get her back to the house. The painters leave at 5. The neutral walls won't show anything.
The appointment. I looked at the insurance policy again. I looked at the medical signature. I realized then that Elias wasn't just an architect of landscapes. He was an architect of accidents. I looked at the clock on the diner wall. 3:30. I had 90 minutes before the painters left. 90 minutes before I was alone in a house that was being painted white to hide the blood. I picked up the diner's landline. I didn't call the police. I knew Elias. He had the mayor in his pocket. He had the city council on his board. A claim of a secret insurance policy and a bruise on my arm wouldn't be enough to stop him. He'd have me committed before the sun went down. I dialed a different number, a number I hadn't called in 15 years. "Hello? Mike?" I said when the lead painter answered.
Mrs. Sterling? Where are you? Mr. Sterling is here. He's looking for you. He's very upset about the wagon.
"Mike, listen to me," I said, my voice cold and hard. "I need you to do something. Don't leave at 5. Tell him the trim in the study is taking longer. Tell him you need to stay until 7. And Mike, bring the industrial floor sander into the hallway. The loud one."
Ma'am?
"Just do it, Mike. If you stay, I'll give you the original blueprints for the Sterling estate, the ones that prove the structural fault. You can sell them to the insurance adjusters. You'll never have to paint a wall again." There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear Elias shouting in the background, a muffled, distant roar.
7 o'clock,
Mike said.
I'll be here.
I hung up. I looked at the station wagon in the parking lot. I realized then that being sturdy wasn't a weakness. A foundation doesn't just hold things up. It's the hardest part of the house to break. And when it shifts, the entire structure comes down with it. I wasn't going to run. I was going back to the house. I was going to meet them in the neutral light of the Swiss coffee walls. But I wasn't going as the wife. I was going as the demolition. The house was no longer a home. It was a gallery of wet white mirrors. The Swiss coffee paint had covered every scuff, every smudge, and every shadow of the last 25 years. As I walked through the front door, the brightness was blinding. The painters had finished the walls and were moving on to the trim, their movements silhouettes against the stark, clinical glare of the work lights. Elias was standing in the foyer, his silver watch gleaming under the LEDs. He looked like a man who had successfully conquered a territory. He didn't look at me as I entered. He looked at the wall behind me, checking for drips.
"The wagon is in the driveway, Sarah," he said.
His voice was a low, vibrating hum that seemed to resonate through the newly painted floorboards.
"I assume you found whatever it was you were looking for in the city?"
"I just needed some air, Elias," I said, my hand tightening on the envelope hidden beneath my sweater. The fumes were giving me a headache.
"A headache,"
he repeated. He finally turned to look at me. His eyes were devoid of the heat I'd seen in the pantry. They were cold, architectural.
"Nora was worried. She thought you'd had another episode. She's upstairs, resting. The move has been hard on her."
The move. He spoke as if Nora were the one who had spent a lifetime building this life, and I was merely the packing material. I looked past him to where Mike, the lead painter, was working on the baseboards near the study.
He didn't look up, but I saw the tension in his shoulders. The industrial floor sander sat in the middle of the hallway like a dormant beast. "I'm going to go to bed," I said. "The headache hasn't passed." "Good," Elias said, his voice softening into that terrifying, artificial concern. "Rest is exactly what you need, Sarah. In fact, I've asked the painters to focus on the hallway tonight. It might be a bit loud, but think of it as white noise. It'll drown out the world." Psychologically, the imbalance was now absolute. He was giving me permission to disappear. He wanted me in that room, under the covers, a sturdy object to be moved later. He believed that by taking my card and branding me porous, he had stripped me of my agency. He didn't realize that a ghost has one advantage. A ghost can see through the walls. I went upstairs. The hallway smelled of chemical peaches and wet dust. I entered the master bedroom, the room I had shared with Elias for a quarter of a century. It was already partially packed. My clothes had been shoved into cardboard boxes, while Elias's suits remained pristine on their cedar hangers. I lay down on the bed, fully dressed, and pulled the quilt up to my chin. I placed the envelope and the burner phone under my pillow. 10 minutes later, the roar started. It was a mechanical scream, the industrial sander Mike had moved into the hallway. The floor beneath my bed vibrated, a rhythmic, bone-deep shudder. To anyone else, it would have been an intolerable intrusion. To me, it was a shield. Under the cover of that noise, I heard the guest room door open. I didn't move. I kept my breathing slow, rhythmic, pretending to be the porous woman he expected. Through the sliver of space beneath my bedroom door, I saw a shadow pass, then another. The master bedroom and the guest room shared a wall, a thin lath and plaster barrier that Elias had never gotten around to soundproofing. In the silence of a normal night, you could hear a cough. In the roar of the sander, they thought they were in a vacuum. I slid out of bed and pressed my ear to the wall near the headboard. Even through the vibration, I heard the laughter. It was Nora's, a bright, jagged sound that cut through the mechanical drone. "Is she out?" Nora asked. Her voice was muffled, but the intimacy of it was a physical weight. "She's resting," Elias replied. I could hear the sneer in his tone. "The sander will keep her in place. Mike knows to keep it running until I give the signal." "You're so cruel to her, Elias," Nora murmured. There was no pity in her voice, only a dark, flirtatious admiration. "It's a wonder she hasn't broken yet." "She's sturdy, remember?" Elias said. I heard the sound of a glass clinking against wood. "Sturdy things don't break. They just wear down until they're useless. Once the trust transfer is finalized tomorrow, we'll move her to the clinic. The porous memory narrative is already documented. Maya is already convinced her mother needs professional care." My heart stopped. The appointment Nora had messaged about wasn't for me to die. Not yet. It was for me to be committed. They were going to use my own daughter to sign the papers, claiming my accidents and wandering were signs of early onset dementia. The insurance policy was the endgame, a reward for their patience once I was tucked away in a locked ward. "And the coastal project?" Nora asked. "We leave at midnight," Elias said. "The house sale goes through on Friday. The painters will be finished by morning. When the real estate agent comes for the walkthrough, there won't be a single trace of Sarah Sterling left in these walls. Just clean, neutral space." I pulled away from the wall, my skin crawling. The betrayal by Elias was a known quantity now, but the way he spoke of me, as a nuisance to be scrubbed away like a stain, felt like a new kind of violence. Then I heard a different sound. Not laughter. It was the sound of skin on skin. The rhythmic, wet thud of their fun in the next room, punctuated by Nora's melodic, theatrical moans. They were doing it right there, feet away from where they thought I was sleeping, fueled by the thrill of my proximity. The noise of the sander provided the tempo for their betrayal. I sat on the floor in the darkness, the white walls of my bedroom pressing in on me.
I looked at the red marks on my arm, now turning a sickly yellow-purple. The realization hit me then, a cold, psychological truth. Elias didn't love Nora. He didn't love Maya. He loved the spatial harmony of a life where he was the only architect. Nora was just a vibrant color he was using to paint over me. Maya was just a structural element he was moving to secure his foundation. He was a monster who built beautiful things out of people's lives until they were hollowed out. I reached under the pillow and pulled out the burner phone. I looked at the time. 6:15 p.m. Mike would keep the sander running until 7. I had 45 minutes. I didn't go to the guest room to confront them. Not yet. Instead, I stood up and walked to the closet. I pulled out Elias's favorite charcoal suit, the one he'd planned to wear for the Coastal Project launch. I took the florist's receipt for the white lilies. I took the medical exam form with the forged signature. I took the trust dissolution papers. I tucked them into the pockets of his suit. Then, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to the master bathroom and turned on the water in the oversized soaking tub, the one Elias called the focal point of the suite. I didn't plug the drain. I let the water roar, a secondary layer of noise to mask my movements. I walked out of the bedroom and into the hallway. Mike was at the far end of the hall, the sander roaring between us. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine. I didn't say a word. I just nodded toward the study. He adjusted his goggles and leaned harder into the sander, the noise reaching a crescendo. I slipped down the back stairs and out into the yard. The evening air was cool, smelling of damp earth and the coming rain. I went to the shed where Elias kept his professional-grade herbicides, the ones he used to ensure perfect lawns for his clients. There was a specific bottle in the back, sulfuric acid, used for pH adjustment in large-scale irrigation systems. I took the bottle and walked back to the station wagon. I realized then that Elias had made one fatal error in his design. He had assumed that because I was sturdy, I was a fixed point. He forgot that the most dangerous thing in a house isn't the storm outside. It's the foundation that decides it no longer wants to hold the weight. I looked up at the second-story window. The light in the guest room flickered. They thought I was a ghost. They thought I was a memory they were painting over. I got back into the house, moving through the kitchen, which was now a pristine white void. I stood in the center of the room, listening to the roar of the sander and the water in the tub above. Elias was about to realize that some stains don't come out with paint. I heard the sander stop. The silence that followed was deafening. "Sarah?" Elias's voice called out from the top of the stairs. He sounded breathless, his voice tight with the post-coital adrenaline of his betrayal. "Sarah, why is the water running?" I didn't answer. I stayed in the kitchen, in the dark, and waited for him to come down the stairs. The silence after the industrial sander stopped was not a relief. It was a vacuum. It felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the first crack in the porcelain. Upstairs, the water I had left running in the soaking tub continued to roar, a distant, hollow thudding that sounded like a waterfall inside a tomb. I stood in the center of the kitchen. The painters had moved their gear to the garage, but Mike was still there, leaning against the door frame of the study, his face partially obscured by the shadows. He was the only witness to the sturdy one standing in the dark. Elias's footsteps on the stairs were heavy and deliberate. He wasn't rushing. He was a man who believed he was still in control of the choreography. When he reached the bottom step, he was tucking his shirt into his trousers, his movements brisk and clinical. He looked at me, and for a fraction of a second, a flicker of genuine surprise crossed his face. Not because I was awake, but because I was standing so still. "The water, Sarah," he said, his voice regaining that sharp supervisory edge. "The tub is going to overflow. Go upstairs and turn it off before you ruin the new flooring." "The flooring is fine, Elias," I said. My voice was low, vibrating with a frequency I didn't recognize. "I left it running because I wanted to see if you'd notice anything other than yourself tonight." He stopped mid-stride. He looked at the bottle of sulfuric acid I had set on the kitchen island, the white plastic jug looking stark and clinical against the Swiss coffee backdrop. His eyes moved from the bottle to my face, and I saw the first tremor of true irritation. "What is this?" he asked, gesturing to the acid. "Have you finally lost your mind? Are you playing chemist now, along with your midnight wandering?" Nora appeared at the top of the stairs. She was wearing her plum robe again, but it was disheveled, her hair a messy gold halo. She looked down at us, her hand resting on the banister that had just been painted a high-gloss white. She didn't look afraid, she looked annoyed, like a spectator watching a play that was running too long. "Is she having a moment, Elias?" Nora called down. "I told you, she's getting worse. The fumes must be affecting her." "I'm not having a moment, Nora," I said, looking up at her. "I'm having a realization. I'm realizing that for 25 years, I've been the one holding the structural integrity of this family together, while you and Elias have been termites." Elias stepped into the kitchen, his presence looming, trying to occupy the space. He tried to reach for my arm, the same arm he had bruised earlier, but I stepped back, the island between us. "Enough, Sarah," he hissed. "You're making a scene in front of the help. Mike, you can go now. We'll settle the invoice tomorrow." "Mike's staying," I said. Elias turned to look at the painter. Mike didn't move. He stayed in the shadows of the hallway, his goggles pushed up on his forehead. "The trim in the study isn't finished, Mr. Sterling. I have to stay until 7. It's in the contract." Elias's jaw tightened. The spatial harmony he craved was being disrupted by a man he considered a tool. He turned back to me, his eyes turning into 2 black points of fury. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Elias whispered, leaning over the island. "But let me make the reality very clear to you. Tomorrow morning, you are going to the Grayson Clinic. The papers are already drafted. Maya has already seen the reports of your incidents. If you fight me, I will ensure you never see her again. I will make sure the trust is dissolved before you can even hire a lawyer." Psychologically, he was playing his final card, the daughter. He knew that Maya was the only thing I had left to lose. He was using my love for her as the final weight to crush me. "I saw the insurance policy, Elias," I said. The silence that followed was different. It was the sound of a structural failure. Nora's hand gripped the banister tighter. Elias didn't blink, but I saw the pulse in his neck jump. "I went to the bank," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "I saw the policy for $3 million. I saw the forged medical examiner's signature, and I saw that Nora is the secondary beneficiary on the safe deposit box. You aren't just sending me to a clinic, Elias. You're waiting for the accidental overdose or the unfortunate fall in the ward, so you can collect the capital for your coastal dream." Elias didn't deny it. He didn't offer a frantic excuse. He simply stood there, his face a mask of cold architectural calculation. $3 million is a lot of money, Sarah, he said, his voice devoid of any human warmth. It's enough to ensure that Maya has the life she deserves. A life without your stagnancy. You should see it as your final contribution to the family. It's the most useful you've been in years. The emotional escalation hit me then, a wave of such profound, cold betrayal that it felt like my blood was turning to ice. He wasn't a man who had made a mistake. He was a man who had decided I was waste material. "And what about the Sterling estate blueprints, Elias?" I asked. "The ones from 15 years ago. The ones that prove you knew the retaining wall would fail." Elias's eyes flickered toward the study. He knew the metal box was there. He knew I had the key. "You wouldn't," he breathed. "That would destroy the firm. It would destroy Maya's future, too." "Maya's future is built on a lie, just like this house," I said. "I'd rather she be poor and honest than rich on the blood of her mother." Elias moved then. He didn't go for the acid. He went for me. He bypassed the island with a speed that caught me off guard, his hand reaching for my throat. He was no longer the refined architect. He was the monster I had finally unmasked. "You stupid, sturdy bitch," he spat, his fingers closing around my neck. "You think you can dismantle me? I built you. I gave you this life, and I can take it back whenever I want." His grip was crushing. I couldn't breathe. I saw Nora at the top of the stairs, her mouth open in a silent "oh" of shock. But she didn't move to help me. She just watched. Behind Elias, I saw Mike step out of the shadows. He was holding a heavy metal paint tray. But I didn't need Mike. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the burner phone. I hadn't just been recording our conversation. I had been on a live conference call with the board of directors of the Sterling Group for the last 10 minutes. Elias's own partners were listening to him choke his wife in a kitchen-painted Swiss coffee. I slammed the phone onto the marble island, the speakerphone on. "Elias, is that you?" "Elias, let her go!" The voice of his senior partner, Arthur, boomed through the kitchen. Elias froze. His hands stayed on my throat, but the strength left them. He looked down at the phone, then at me. The realization of what he had just done, the violence, the admission of fraud, the exposure of his true nature, hit him like a falling beam. He released me, and I collapsed against the cabinets, gasping for air. "Arthur," Elias stammered, his voice cracking. It's not what it sounds like. Sarah is unstable. She's threatening me with acid." "We heard it all, Elias." Arthur's voice was cold, filled with a professional disgust that was more devastating than any scream. "The insurance, the trust, the blueprints. Stay where you are. The police are already on their way. And Elias, don't bother coming to the office. The locks are already being changed." The power shift was instantaneous. Elias looked around his pristine, white kitchen, and for the first time, he looked small. He looked like a man standing in the middle of a ruins. Nora turned and ran back into the guest room, the sound of her door slamming echoing through the house. Elias looked at me. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He didn't look at the phone. He didn't look at Mike. He looked at the bottle of sulfuric acid. "You think you won?" he whispered. "You think you can just walk away and take everything? I'll burn this whole place down before I let you have it." He reached for the bottle, but as his hand closed around the plastic handle, I saw the curiosity hook. the one thing he had forgotten in his haste to cover everything in white. "Elias, wait," I croaked, rubbing my bruised throat. "The painters didn't just do the walls today. They did the floors, too. The sealant. It hasn't cured yet." He looked down. His leather shoes were stuck. The high-gloss sealant on the mahogany floor, hidden under the thin layer of dust in the shadow of the island, was still tacky. By standing still for so long during our confrontation, he had effectively glued himself to the center of his own masterpiece. He tried to yank his foot back, but the floor groaned. And then, from upstairs, the sound of the water stopped. Not because the tub was full, but because the ceiling in the kitchen began to bulge. The water I had left running wasn't just in the tub. I had plugged the secondary drain in the laundry room, too. "The structure is failing, Elias," I said, stepping back toward the garage. "Just like you designed it." The first drop of water hit the Swiss coffee island. It was followed by a heavy, wet thud as a piece of the plaster ceiling gave way. I looked at my husband, trapped in his own house, his shoes stuck in the floor, while the weight of his own neglect prepared to come crashing down. The first crack in the ceiling was a sound I will never forget. It wasn't a snap or a bang. It was a slow, agonizing groan of wood and plaster surrendering to a weight they were never meant to carry. A jagged fissure raced across the Swiss coffee expanse, and then the deluge began. The water didn't fall as a clean stream. It came down as a heavy, gray sludge, a mixture of attic dust, old insulation, and the stagnant residue of pipes that hadn't been flushed in decades. It hit the marble island with a sickening thud, splashing upward and coating the pristine white cabinets in a veil of filth. Elias was still rooted to the center of the kitchen. He had managed to wrench one foot free, but the effort had cost him the sole of his bespoke leather shoe, which remained stuck to the floor like a discarded tongue. He stood lopsided, one hand gripping the edge of the island as the water rained down around him, drenching his charcoal suit. He looked at me, and for a moment, the architect was gone. There was no spatial harmony here, only the chaotic physics of a collapse. "Sarah," he croaked, his voice nearly drowned out by the splashing water. "Sarah, help me move the island. The blueprints. The server is in the cabinet below." I didn't move. I watched a glob of wet plaster land on his shoulder, sliding down his arm like a slow-moving slug. "The server is already compromised, Elias. Arthur and the board have everything they need. You worried about the hardware? You should be worried about the record." Psychologically, I realized that even in the midst of a literal flood, Elias's first instinct was to preserve the data of his life, not the people in it. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't call out for Nora. He wanted to save the blueprints of his lies. It was a staggering realization that for 25 years, I had been protecting a man who was essentially a hollow shell, held together by nothing but his own vanity. Nora came screaming down the stairs then, her designer suitcase bumping against her knees. She stopped at the threshold of the kitchen, her eyes widening as she took in the ruin. The Swiss coffee walls were now streaked with gray, the high-gloss finish marred by the debris. "Elias, what are you doing? We have to go!" she shrieked, shielding her head with a leather handbag. She looked at me, her face twisting with a frantic, desperate hatred. "You did this! You crazy, jealous bitch! You're destroying everything!" "I'm just letting the house express itself, Nora," I said. I felt a strange, cold peace. You wanted drama in the landscape. Here it is. Nora didn't stay to argue. She saw the water rising on the floor, the gray puddle spreading toward her expensive sandals. She turned and ran toward the front door, the same way she had arrived, frantic, selfish, and utterly unwilling to deal with the consequences of the mess she'd helped create. But as she reached the door, the blue lights of the police cruisers strobed through the frosted glass of the foyer. The arrival of the authorities was a quiet affair compared to the roar of the water. 2 officers entered, their boots clacking on the wet floor. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. They simply stood there, taking in the sight of a prominent city architect standing knee-deep in a flood of his own making. His wife, bruised and calm, and a frantic woman trying to flee with a suitcase full of stolen time. "Mr. Sterling?" one of the officers asked, looking at Elias with a mixture of confusion and pity. "We received a call regarding a domestic disturbance and potential fraud." Elias straightened his back. He tried to reclaim the principled architect, smoothing his wet hair with a trembling hand. "There's been an accident with the plumbing, officer. My wife, she's been having some mental health struggles. She's overwhelmed. I was just trying to manage the situation." He looked at me, his eyes pleading for me to play the role. He wanted the sturdy one to step in and stabilize the foundation one last time. He wanted me to lie to the law the way I had lied to myself for 20 years. I walked over to the island and picked up the burner phone. It was still on. Arthur's voice was gone, but the recording light was still blinking. "The mental health struggle is on the record, Elias," I said, handing the phone to the officer. "Along with the confession about the insurance policy and the blueprints. Mike, you can stop now." Mike stepped out from the study, holding a small digital camera. He had been recording from the shadows. He looked at Elias, then at me, and gave a sharp, somber nod. He had his own leverage now, the proof he needed to clear his name from the Sterling estate disaster years ago. "Take them out," I said to the officers. "I want them out of my house." "Your house?" Elias barked, a desperate, jagged laugh escaping him. "The papers are signed, Sarah. The house is on the market. You have nothing." "The papers were signed under duress and based on a fraudulent trust transfer, Elias," I said. "Arthur is already filing the injunction. The house isn't on the market. It's a crime scene." As the officers led Elias toward the door, he had to limp, his one unshod foot dragging on the wet floor. It was a pathetic, uncoordinated movement. Nora followed behind him, her head bowed, her vibrant yellow dress now damp and clinging. She didn't look like a splash of paint anymore. She looked like a smear. The front door closed, and for the first time, the house was truly quiet. The water was still dripping from the ceiling, a slow, rhythmic plink, plink, plink against the marble. The fumes of the paint were still there, but they were being washed away by the smell of wet earth and old wood. I stood in the center of the ruin. I looked at the Swiss coffee walls. They were destroyed. The neutral, perfect void Elias had tried to create was gone, replaced by the messy, gray truth of what lay beneath. I felt a sudden, sharp exhaustion. I walked into the dining room, which was still dry, and sat on one of the lumpy white ghosts, the sofa covered in canvas. I sat in the dark, listening to the house weep. But as I sat there, I realized that the curiosity hook Elias had planted, the Coastal Project, wasn't just about a new firm. It was about a location. I pulled the insurance policy out from my sweater. I looked at the address of the private estate rental Elias had searched for. It wasn't at the coast. It was a clinic. A specific, high-security psychiatric facility in the mountains. And then, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A text message from Maya. "Mom, I'm at the clinic. They said you were being admitted tonight. Dad said you'd be here by 6. Where are you? The doctors are waiting." The air left my lungs.
The appointment hadn't been canceled by the police arrival. It was already in motion. Elias hadn't been taking Nora to the coast tonight. He had been planning to drop me at a locked facility and disappear with my daughter before I could say a word. And Maya was there, waiting for me. I looked at the clock. 6:45. I stood up, my heart hammering. I needed to get to Maya. I needed to show her the insurance policy before Elias could call her from the station and spin a new web of lies. But as I reached for my keys, I heard a sound from the basement. A slow, deliberate creak of a floorboard. The painters were gone. Elias and Nora were in custody. Mike was in his truck out front. Who was in my basement? The basement of our home had always been Elias's blind spot. He viewed it as a mere utility, a subterranean box for the furnace, the water heater, and the structural piers that held up his masterpiece. To him, it was a place of dust and spiders beneath his aesthetic notice. But to me, it was the only part of the house that hadn't been sanitized by his vision. It was the only place that still smelled like the damp earth and the old, unvarnished pine of my childhood. I stood at the top of the stairs, the door slightly ajar. The silence of the flooded kitchen was behind me, the plink-plink of the ceiling leak a frantic metronome. Below, the creak came again. It was a rhythmic, heavy sound. Someone was moving with purpose, unhurried by the chaos upstairs. I didn't turn on the light. I knew the count of the steps, 12 into the dark. As I descended, the temperature dropped. The air grew thick with the smell of the herbicide I'd brought back from the shed earlier. I reached the bottom and pressed myself into the shadows behind the old cedar chest. A beam of light cut through the gloom. It wasn't a flashlight, it was the glow of a tablet. A man was standing by the secondary electrical panel, the one Elias had installed during the renovation to power his confidential servers in the study. He was wearing a dark, high-visibility vest over a charcoal uniform. On his shoulder was a patch for Vanguard Medical Transport. He wasn't a thief. He was the man Elias had hired to make me disappear. "Mr. Sterling?" the man whispered. His voice was gravelly, professional, and devoid of empathy. "The power to the main floor is cut. I'm at the sub-panel. Do you want me to proceed with the sedative protocol?" My heart missed a beat. Sedative protocol. Elias hadn't just planned to commit me. He had planned to drug me in my own home, have me carried out like a piece of unwanted furniture, and wake me up in a locked room 3 hours away. The police arrival had been a variable he hadn't calculated, but his transport was already in the house, a shark swimming in the basement while the sailors were being arrested on the deck. The man tapped the tablet, the blue light illuminating a face that looked like it was carved from granite. He was waiting for an answer from a man who was currently being fingerprinted. "Hello?" I said. My voice was a ghost in the darkness. The man spun around, the tablet light swinging wildly. He didn't look startled. He looked annoyed, like a mechanic interrupted by a faulty part. He saw me, a woman in gardening boots, clutching an envelope of forged insurance documents, standing in the shadows of a flooded basement. "Mrs. Sterling?" he asked. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for a syringe in his vest pocket. "Your husband said you might be confused. He said you might be wandering." "My husband is in a police car," I said, stepping into the blue light. "And you are trespassing." The man checked his tablet. "My contract is with the Sterling Family Trust. The order for transport is signed by Elias Sterling and Maya Sterling. As of 4 p.m. today, you have been declared a danger to yourself, Mrs. Sterling. I'm here to help you get to a safe place." Maya. The name felt like a physical blow. She hadn't just been waiting at the clinic. She had signed the papers. She had given this man the key to our basement.
She had authorized the sedative protocol for the mother who had nursed her, shielded her, and loved her more than her own life. Psychologically, I felt the final pier of my foundation crumble. I could survive Elias's cruelty. I could survive Nora's betrayal. But Maya's complicity was the rot that couldn't be painted over. Maya doesn't know what she's signed, I said, though I knew it was a lie I was telling to save my own heart. She signed it in front of a notary at the clinic, the man said, taking a slow step toward me. Now, Sarah, let's make this easy. If you cooperate, there's no need for the restraints. We can just walk to the van. Restraints. The sturdy one wouldn't be handled with gentleness. If I fought, I would be broken. If I screamed, I would be porous. I have something you should see, I said, reaching into my sweater. The man paused, his hand hovering over the syringe. He expected a weapon. He expected a moment. I pulled out the insurance policy. This is a $3 million policy on my life. The beneficiary is Maya. My husband forged the signature. If you take me to that clinic, you're not helping a patient. You're assisting in a kidnapping designed to trigger a payout. And the board of directors of the Sterling Group is currently on a recorded line with the police. I held up the burner phone. The recording light was still red. The man's eyes flicked to the tablet, then back to me. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt. He was a professional, and professionals don't like being part of a crime that has already been exposed. I have a signed order, he repeated, but the authority had left his voice. You have a contract with a man who no longer has access to his own funds, I said. Check your tablet. I suspect the payment for this transport was just flagged by the bank's fraud department. He tapped the screen. His face went flat. The unusual activity Elias had used as an excuse to take my debit card had worked both ways. Once the board flagged the accounts, the corporate credit Elias used for private services had been frozen. The man sighed, a long, weary sound. He tucked the syringe back into his pocket. I'm not getting paid for a felony, Mrs. Sterling. He walked past me, his shoulder brushing mine. He didn't apologize. He didn't offer to help. He just headed for the basement bulkhead, leaving me alone in the dark. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the basement ringing in my ears. I looked at the electrical panel. The dependency Elias had cultivated was a circle. He depended on my silence. I depended on his provision. But Maya was the variable he had truly mastered. He had taught her to see the world as a series of assets, and in his eyes, I was a depreciating one. I walked back up the stairs. The kitchen was still flooding, the water now an inch deep on the mahogany floors. I didn't care about the damage. I didn't care about the Swiss coffee walls. I picked up the kitchen phone and dialed the clinic. Grayson Clinic, a receptionist answered. I need to speak with Maya Sterling, I said. This is her mother. Tell her the transport has been canceled, and tell her I'm coming to see her. I'm sorry, Mrs. Sterling, but Miss Sterling is currently in a consult with Dr. Aris. She's very upset. She's under the impression that you were involved in an accident at the house. An accident, I whispered. I looked at the sulfuric acid on the island. I looked at the hole in the ceiling. Tell her the house fell down, I said, but tell her the foundation is still here. I hung up and walked out the front door. Mike was still there, sitting in his truck, the engine idling. He looked at me, his eyes wide. You okay, Mrs. Sterling? That guy in the black van just peeled out of here. I need a ride to the mountains, Mike, I said. I'll give you the blueprints tonight. Every single one. Get in, he said. As we pulled out of the driveway, I looked back at the house. It was glowing with the blue and red of the distant police lights, a white, pristine box in the middle of a dark landscape. It looked like a beautiful model.
a miniature of a life that never existed. But as I looked at my reflection in the truck's window, I didn't see this sturdy one. I saw a woman who had finally stopped being a part of the scenery. I was going to find my daughter. I was going to show her the insurance policy, and then I was going to let her choose. But as the truck hit the highway, a new message appeared on the burner phone. It wasn't from Elias. It wasn't from Nora. It was from a number I didn't recognize. The clinic was just the diversion, Sarah. Did you really think Elias would leave the emeralds in his safe deposit box? Check the cedar chest, the one the painters moved. You missed the real blueprint. I gripped the phone, my knuckles white. The cedar chest, the one in the master bedroom, the one the painters had moved to the hallway. Elias hadn't just been moving money, he had been moving a ghost. I told Mike to turn the truck around. He didn't ask why, he just saw the look in my eyes. A cold, focused light that hadn't been there when I was begging for a ride to the mountains. We sped back toward the house, the headlights cutting through the rising mist like twin blades. The police were gone, leaving only the yellow crime scene tape fluttering against the Swiss coffee porch. The house looked like a ghost, white and hollowed out. I stepped through the front door, my boots splashing in the receding floodwaters. The smell of wet plaster and chemical paint was suffocating, but I didn't stop. I went straight for the stairs. The master bedroom was a mess of half-packed boxes and white drop cloths. The cedar chest sat in the center of the hallway, looking heavy and ancient against the stark, neutral walls. Elias had always hated this chest. He called it clunky and historically inaccurate. I had insisted on keeping it because it was the only thing I had left of my mother. I knelt before it. My hands were steady now. I didn't reach for the wedding veil inside. Instead, I pressed my fingers into the ornate molding at the base, searching for the internal catch I hadn't touched in 20 years. A soft click echoed in the silent hallway. The false bottom of the chest shifted. I pulled out a leather portfolio, its surface cool and dusty. Inside wasn't a secret bank account or a set of emeralds. It was a set of architectural vellums, the original designs for the coastal project, the Sterling estate, and the city park. I turned the pages, my eyes tracing the lines I had drawn by hand in the small hours of the night while Elias slept beside me. Every masterpiece that had built his reputation, every visionary design that had earned him national awards, bore a signature in the bottom right corner. Not Elias Sterling, S. Vance. Sarah Vance, my maiden name. Elias wasn't the architect. He was the salesman. He had the charm, the voice, and the gender that the boardrooms of the 90s preferred. I had been the one who calculated the loads, the one who saw the spatial flow, and the one who designed the foundations. I had given him my work, my name, and my silence to build the family I thought we needed. I was the sturdy foundation, literal and metaphorical. He hadn't just used me, he had built his entire identity on the bones of mine. I wondered if you'd find it tonight. I turned. Maya was standing at the top of the stairs. She wasn't at the clinic. She was wearing her raincoat, her face pale but her eyes sharp, eyes that looked exactly like mine. To text, I whispered, holding the portfolio. It was you. I knew if I told you to go to the clinic, you'd run there to save me, Maya said, her voice trembling but certain. But I needed you to come back here first. I needed you to see what he was really trying to liquidate. She walked toward me and sat on the floor beside the cedar chest. Dad didn't just want the insurance money, Mom. He wanted the intellectual property rights. He was going to sell your old designs as new coastal prototypes. He needed you committed so you couldn't claim the copyright.
He needed me to sign the papers so he could act as the sole executor of the Vance Sterling archives. Psychologically, the circle was complete. Elias hadn't just tried to erase me from the house. He had tried to erase me from the history of my own mind. He wanted the credit for the very foundation I had provided. "I didn't sign the papers at the clinic, Mom," Maya said, reaching out to take my hand. Her touch wasn't the crushing pressure of Elias. It was a firm, grounding warmth. "I signed a statement for the board of directors. I've been working with Mike and the firm's auditor for months. Every time Dad sent me a gift from the trust, I tracked the source. I knew he was draining you. I was just waiting for him to get loud enough for the police to hear." I looked at my daughter, the girl I thought was Daddy's girl. I realized then that she hadn't been distancing herself from me. She had been building a fortress around me. She had played the role of the selfish, entitled daughter, so Elias would keep her close, let her see the books, and trust her with the secret places. She wasn't her father's daughter. She was mine. The sturdy one had raised a daughter who knew how to wait for the storm. "He's never coming back, Mom," Maya whispered. "The board is filing for total restitution, and Nora, she's already given a statement. She's trying to trade Elias's head for her own freedom. She told the police about the accident he was planning for you at the clinic." I looked around at the white walls of the hallway. The Swiss coffee paint was still wet, but it didn't look like a fresh start anymore. It looked like a shroud. "What do we do with the house?" I asked. Maya looked at the portfolio in my lap, the record of 25 years of stolen brilliance. She stood up and offered me her hand. "We strip it to the studs," she said. "And this time, we put your name on the door." I stood up, the vellums heavy in my arms. I felt a sudden, profound sense of space. The house was a ruin. My marriage was a crime scene, and my sister was a ghost. But as I looked at Maya, I realized that the foundation hadn't just held the house up. It had held the truth until the world was ready to see it. I walked to the master bedroom window and looked out at the garden. The rain had stopped. The moon was out, reflecting off the standing water on the terrace. It was messy. It was broken. And it was mine. I picked up the burner phone and looked at the final message I'd received. I deleted it. I didn't need the secrets anymore. I walked down the stairs with Maya, leaving the white walls and the wet paint behind. As we stepped out onto the porch, the air was cold and sweet. Mike was still there, leaning against his truck, waiting for the blueprints I'd promised him. I handed him the portfolio. "The structural faults are on page 10, Mike," I said. "Tell the insurance adjusters that the architect herself provided the evidence." He looked at the signature on the vellum. S. Vance. He looked at me, then at Maya. He gave a slow, respectful tip of his cap. "Good night, Sarah," he said. We watched him drive away. The house stood behind us, a pale, silent monument to a man who no longer existed. I looked at Maya, and for the first time in 20 years, I didn't feel the need to fix anything. I didn't feel the need to be sturdy. I just felt. The monster had tried to paint over my life, but he'd forgotten that white is the most fragile color of all. It only takes one drop of the truth to stain it forever. I took a deep breath of the night air, the silence finally, truly belonging to me.